I have spoken with someone who, like, their child was experiencing, like, coprolalia that involved touching
Mm,
other people. A lot of the problem lied in the fact that it was a boy who was the one experiencing coprolalia. Because while there are consequences for, like, when a girl does this, a lot of the time there's the perception that, like, boys are doing it on purpose or they're using their Tourette's to get away with it. And so I
I
think
know.
that depending on the situation, like, it sucks for everyone. I know that we're all supposed to be like, Tourette's made me who I am as a person and it helped me grow and change, but it kind of sucks for everyone.
Welcome to The Uptick, brought to you by the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, empowering children and adults through education, advocacy, and research by sharing the stories and experiences relevant to the TS community.
Hello, and thanks for joining us on this episode of The Uptick. I am joined here with Mason. Mason is a graduate student earning their master's in counseling psychology. They have previously worked in TS advocacy with NJCTS, and we're so excited to have them here on the podcast. Mason, how was your day going?
Day's going good, just doing a little bit of schoolwork, graduating in May, so getting kind of like all the final stuff done beforehand.
Kind of at the crunch before the school year ends, yeah. Well, listen, I wanted to reach out to you and ask you to be on this podcast after I saw a YouTube video you did a few years ago on coprolalia in the Tourette community. One of the things that you talked about in the video was how, as advocates and allies in the TS community, we often just inadvertently other people with coprolalia or kind of say that, no, that's not Tourette's. Like what they're going through is, because we're trying to combat those stereotypes that the media sensationalizes on, Tourette's the swearing disorder, those kinds of things. And so we come from a good place, but the way we say it, the words we use, like, no, that's not Tourette's. Only 10% of people with Tourette's have swearing. When we say it like that, we without realizing it, we're othering those people. And I thought you did a fantastic job explaining that in the video. Do you want to talk to our listeners a little bit about that video and what got you to create it?
So it's actually really interesting. I made that video, I believe in like 2019, 2020, I don't remember, at the start of Tourette Syndrome Awareness Month, because I had already started seeing like all of the like efforts to distance Tourette's from the people with coprolalia. And it was kind of like a ranty kind of video. I have like 30 subscribers, so I wasn't expecting many people to see it. So it was just kind of me getting it off the top of my head and how I was feeling about it. Because it does sometimes feel like Tourette's advocacy, like mainstream Tourette's advocacy, does try and distance themselves from coprolalia. And I remember the one thing that I said in the video that I was like, ooh, that's a good thing to say. That's like a mic drop moment, was like, a lot of the time people will say, oh, coprolalia is not Tourette's, but for me it is.
It was a mic drop moment. Yeah, that's when I saw that and I was like, oh, I have to, interview them. They need to be on the podcast because this is something I've been saying for a while. I remember one of the Tourette camps a number of years ago, I think it was Camp Twitch and Shout. They were making some, you might actually, if you know more about this, I want you to tell the story because I only heard it through someone else. I wasn't there, but apparently they were making some video to dispel myths and stereotypes about TS. And they really made a big emphasis on Tourette is not a swearing disorder. And they were like interviewing these kids with Tourette's who were like, I have Tourette's. I don't swear uncontrollably. Like, I don't have coprolalia. And it really just drove home that point that, like, yes, we need to be careful to dispel stereotypes, but we also need to be careful not to other those 10 to 15% of people with Tourette's that do have coprolalia. For them, coprolalia is Tourette's. It is a swearing disorder for them. I mean, Tourette's is so much. It's so much more than swearing, but that is a part of it.
I had actually never seen that video. I have my own issues with Twitch and Shout, but that maybe we could talk about later. But like, I had never seen that video, but it does really drive home that point. I go on this like rant on Twitter every once in a while. People will be like, oh, Tourette's is not coprolalia, only 10% of people. And especially when it comes from people who do not have coprolalia, the way that I phrased it is that immediately outs you as someone who is not safe. When you hear about discrimination against people with Tourette's, and the discrimination that I personally have experienced for my Tourette's, The things that are discriminated against are not the physical tics. They're not the whistling. I have physical tics. I have a whistling tic. I have so many other vocal tics. But the things that I receive discrimination for are my coprolalia. And it's a very stigmatized aspect of the condition. And I think it's very important that we keep that idea in our heads.
I notice even subtle things like when we say, oh, only 10% of people with Tourette's have coprolalia. Like just putting the word only in there almost makes it like minimizes it. It kind of casts them aside. Like, oh no, you're just part of that only 10% group. And something I've in the last couple of years tried to be more mindful of is that. And like, I don't say only, I would just say, well, Tourette's comes in lots of different flavors and shapes and sizes. And some people do have coprolalia, about 10% do. Some have echopraxia, some have copopraxia, some have complex vocal, like all these different manifestations of it. I'm reminded of that iceberg slide that we always love to share in Tourette's presentations, where it's got like the iceberg and it's only tics are at the top. We could add to that iceberg all the other dimensions. And that's the other thing I was really excited to talk to you about was intersectionality when it comes to TS, and how Tourette syndrome is yet another kind of an identity that we form. I'm so curious to talk to you about how that plays into other identities that a person may have.
So that's actually something that I really emphasize a lot in like my own advocacy and like talking to people about it. For example, at programs that I've worked for and conversations that I've had about like, if you are pulled over, how to have an interaction with police when you have Tourette's, or if you are in an accident and need to have a conversation with like EMS about having Tourette's. Those are great conversations that we need to have. But also my experience as a small white person is going to be very different from the experience of a Black person or like even like a man. Those experiences are going to be very different. In Tourette's communities, we tend to focus on like the presentation of like young white boys who have tics. And a lot of the research is done on young white boys. Kind of similar to the way it's done with ADHD and autism. We're familiar with the presentation of the way a lot of neurodiversity appears in young white boys. And when we try and add that intersectionality into it, it's very difficult to find those kind of intersections and find the research and the things to support it. For Tourette's organizations, they will have like summer camp programs, or they'll have like programs for children and teenagers with Tourette's. And when they ask people to participate in those programs, oftentimes the people that are getting paid to be the administrative team and to be the medical team and to be the people who are leading that program, they are people who do not have Tourette's. But when you have, like, for example, a mentor figure or someone who does have Tourette's, they are often not paid. I've had like experiences where friends of mine have been like, you should work for Twitch and Shout because it's a really great program and I think you would get a lot out of it. And it's like, I would love to, but I live in Minnesota. How am I going to get to Georgia? Are they going to pay me to get to Georgia? I have a full-time job and I need to pay rent. Even if I'm not physically in my house, I have to pay rent. So can I afford to go and spend a week working at camp? I am an adult with expertise. I have lived experience. I don't have a master's degree yet, but I am very close to a master's degree. I have lived experience and I have clinical expertise. So it's almost a little bit insulting to be like, hey, you can come work for us, but we're not going to pay you, you know? And it's not something that just like camps for people with disabilities do. There's like a lot of camps for like LGBT youth that do the same thing where it's like, oh, we would love to have an LGBT adult mentor, but we're not going to pay you.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember very specifically, there is a Facebook group called the Tourette Syndrome Intersectionality Group. There was someone who was doing a research project or offered to pay adults with Tourette's to complete the project. And someone was like, I really appreciate this because there's so much talk of, oh, give back, help the families. And it's like, I can't afford to do that, but you can pay me to do that, you know?
Wow, I love what you just said. I have spent so much of my own dollars, sweat, tears, time, like just volunteering in this space, and I love to do it. But we don't talk about that. How like all the costs that I've eaten. This next weekend, I'll be going out to Long Island for a Tourette's event, and I don't. It's very unclear whether I'm going to get reimbursed for that. but it's like the $20 here and there. And for me, I'm able to do that. I'm privileged. I can I don't, I don't bat an eye at it. For someone without the means, that's a barrier to being involved in Tourette's advocacy. We don't really talk about the financial component that is expected of you in addition to your time, your expertise, your service.
Yeah, I think as well, like, it's kind of similar to how in a lot of fields you're expected to do an unpaid internship to like finish your program. And so like if you don't have the means to kind of work for free for a year, then you don't get to do it. And I feel like that really limits the amount of perspectives that we see in Tourette's advocacy and in like the counseling field, for example. Like if you are not a person coming from not necessarily even a background of generational wealth, but if you're not a person coming from a middle class background, or if you're a person that has other expenses, like if you have a more severe disability that limits your ability to travel, or if you are a queer person or a person of color who is statistically more likely to be living in poverty, it limits the exposure of those people to like kids. I've had conversations a lot about representation, especially in my graduate school program. I've had a lot of conversations about representation and how when I work with kids with Tourette's and teens with Tourette's, there's like an empathetic shorthand where they know they can trust me and they understand that I have an experience because I'm not just an abled person or a non-Tourette's having person who's trying to pretend like I get it.
Right.
And representation is so important. Like I know a young man who I've met through advocacy who is a really big soccer fan. And he didn't know about Tim Howard having Tourette's. But when I told him, he was ecstatic. He's like, oh my God, I want to be a professional soccer player. And I thought that I couldn't do that because of my tics. And now that he has that representation and that person that shows him, I can do this. And this is something that I have the possibility and the potential to do. It really helped him feel better about himself. Some of the programs I've worked for, they're very well-intentioned, but sometimes their intentions do more harm than good. There was a participant who used they, them pronouns. And this was before I was out as non-binary. And so I was feeling very protective of this participant, independent of this, all weekend they were being dead named and they were being misgendered.
Oh.
And it was one of those things that when I asked and I was like, hey, I think that it would be appropriate for us to go around and share our pronouns and our preferred names. And when I said that, I was told that that was not a good idea because it might lead to bullying.
But I'm so confused that bullying is already happening. If they're referring to this person by their dead name, that's a form of bullying, right?
Yeah.
Oh.
Advocacy has like the best of intentions, but it doesn't necessarily work out in the best way. During the pandemic, there was the influx of teenage girls who were presenting with tic symptoms. The immediate response from a lot of organizations was to be like, oh, we don't know why this is happening, but this isn't true Tourette's. This is not how Tourette's works. And like, there's also a lot of people online who infuriate me a little bit, who think they're like the Tourette's police, and they'll comment on someone's videos and say, this person is faking, they don't really have Tourette's. And I think that it's really dangerous to like form the Tourette's police, essentially, because from the outside, a lot of these people, their tics are fundamentally indistinguishable from quote unquote true Tourette's. They've been termed functional tic-like attacks is like the diagnostic term, but they're functionally indistinguishable from quote unquote genuine Tourette's. And so by being like, oh, this person is faking, it kind of opens the door for everyone to be perceived as faking.
Right.
It also doesn't help that specifically the population that people are saying are quote unquote faking is young teenage girls, many of whom are experiencing like mental illness and other experiences that make it very hard for them. And I've never heard someone look at a white man and say, that man is faking his tics.
Wow, I just need a moment to reflect. You just made some really brilliant... No, you made some brilliant points there. And I'm like, which one should we unpack first? That was so great. Okay, it just in general terms, the idea of faking our tics. I mean, that is a lesser talked about stereotype that we face in the Tourette community, mostly in schools, like teachers will accuse students of faking their tics. And I think that's always like, that's kind of in the back of our head, like our collective identity as people with TS. There's always this concern that we're going to be called out, that someone is not going to believe us, not going to believe that this is a real diagnosis. Because in many cases that we know these people that have called us out for this, and concerned that we will be told or punished because we're doing something that, really we can't control, but they think it's just behavioral. This is something I was hoping to discuss with you, the ways that particularly young white cis boys can get away with a little bit more rambunctiousness, impulsivity, I'll say aggression, roughhousing, like there's, and then that also means they can get away more with just the movements and sounds and twitches and speaking out of turn, whether it's a vocal tic or not, maybe even if it is behavioral. I think we give boys, particularly young white boys, more leeway on that. I was a young white boy. I can say I had more leeway on that. I definitely got it. Do you have any thoughts or any more insightful, brilliant comments on this?
Honestly, like, not to I feel like it really depends on the situation. I have spoken with someone who, like, their child was experiencing like copropraxia that involved touching other people. A lot of the problem lied in the fact that it was a boy who was the one experiencing copropraxia. Because while there are consequences for like when a girl does this, a lot of the time there's the perception that like boys are doing it on purpose or they're using their Tourette's to get away with it. And so I think that depending on the situation, like, it sucks for everyone. I know that we're all supposed to be like, Tourette's made me who I am as a person and it helped me grow and change, but it kind of sucks for everyone.
Yeah, kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
And I think too, like, the experiences of young women and girls, the experiences that I mentioned, like of these young women on TikTok, where it's like, they're obviously faking their tics for attention. And a lot of the things that young women do in the world are seen as like a ploy for attention, like in a way that things that boys do and young men do are not seen as ploys for attention. I think it's something that can affect different people in different ways. And it's not even necessarily just like a gendered thing. If you are a physically attractive person, you are a lot more likely to have your tics like be quirky or interesting or cute than a person who is not conventionally attractive. There's like a video that went around of like an attractive like 20-year-old man like who's like blinking and like having like motor tics and being like, you have to stop saying my twitches are cute. And it's like, yes. And if you were not a conventionally attractive young white man, would your twitches be quote unquote cute,
Right.
So a lot of it comes down to like not just gender, but the way you're perceived by society as well.
It's like pretty privilege specific to Tourette syndrome.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I was thinking more about the functional tic diagnosis and the wave of teenage girls and young women that were presenting with Tourette-like symptoms during the pandemic. I remember so much of the immediate reaction was, well, we don't really know what this is, but it's clearly, it doesn't look like Tourette's. They present themselves to a therapist and it goes away quickly, it seems. Or I heard other people saying that they all had the same tics, that they watched a video and then they were only having those tics that they saw in the video. And people would say, well, that's not how Tourette's works. Real Tourette's, you generate new tics. They're novel, they change, they're whatever. This is the first time I've thought of this in the context of what you said around women's concerns are often discarded as just, oh, she's just doing this for attention. Because that's exactly what this was. It was the reaction to it was, oh, that's not real Tourette's. Oh, it goes away after a therapy session. Oh, they're just mimicking some guy's tics in a video. Like, it really downplayed it and just shoved them aside, cast them aside. I thought that did a big disservice when really we should have been saying, wow, our advocacy, our outreach, our videos, we're reaching people. There are people that never knew that they, and now they're going to see their neurologist for the first time. People that have had this stuff for years are getting diagnosed. This is exciting. Sure, we don't understand the details and why it's manifesting this way, stress of the pandemic, quarantine, who knows? But I think the attitude could have been a lot more productive and positive, but it's unfortunate. I think that was a missed opportunity.
Yeah. The people who are often very invested in people, quote unquote, faking are not necessarily even the people with Tourette's themselves. A lot of the people who are invested in people faking are like family members who like they've seen the struggle that their family member or their friend has gone through, and they see that this person is like, oh, they're making fun of it, and my family member has struggled and they've gone through so much. There's like one Tourette's YouTuber who they make a lot of videos of like people on TikTok being like, this person's faking, this person's
Oh,
faking, this person's faking. They have a lot of people in their comments being like, oh, thank you. My son has Tourette's, and it really upsets me when I see people making fun of his experience. And so it's really interesting. I think it's very similar to the way that in like a lot of online neurodivergent communities, it doesn't matter if you have a professional diagnosis. If you're deriving benefit from like the techniques and the tools that you're finding online and you're not hurting anyone, I don't really see what's so wrong with that. Like, I know I have people in my life who are not officially diagnosed as autistic, but they gain benefit from executive function hacks that you'll see online, or they watch a
absolutely.
how to ADHD video about emotional dysregulation, and it really helps them with the way that they're experiencing their life. If you're not hurting anybody, I don't see how finding that community and getting those supports is hurting anybody.
I'm curious to hear a little more about your experience as someone with they them pronouns and Tourette syndrome, how that's been received by the medical community and society at large. Have you faced any particular challenges, discrimination because of that intersection of identities?
So, not myself personally, but if you do have what is like a mental health or a neurological diagnosis or a neurodevelopmental diagnosis, you will have a harder time accessing medical transition, especially since a lot of like this transphobic rhetoric has been being spread across the country in a much more concrete and very scary way. A lot
Right.
of the way that it's being spread is kind of this idea that like trans masculine people, which is people who are assigned female at birth that are either non-binary or transitioning to be a trans man, there's this idea that like a lot of them are just poor lost teenage girls who don't know what's going on, and like they think that they found a community and they decide that they quote unquote decide that they want to be trans so
Uh,
that they can fit in with their community. Autistic teenage girls are more likely to be trans than neurotypical teenage girls. And there's like
Yeah, I've
very,
seen them use those stats.
yeah, J.K. Rowling made like a very terrible, not terrible, but like this very awful and like transphobic document. And part of the things that she mentioned was autistic girls are represented in greater numbers in people being referred for transitioning treatment. And those are reasons that people are often denied transitioning treatment because it's like, oh, you are not capable of the reasoning skills to know that you're trans. And that's messed up. But
Yeah, the other thing that bothers me about that, I mean, we could go off on J.K. Rowling for an hour here, but and the turf and anti-trans rhetoric she's been spewing, but that is so stigmatizing to people with autism. Like to say that they are not able to understand their own sense of identity and form that. Like, sure, their brains work differently, but their brains still work. It's just a different way of functioning. It's an insult to those people as well.
so I work specifically with clients in my internship who are autistic. And so one thing that we discuss a lot in that population is conflicting access needs.
Hmm.
Because if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. No one speaks for the entire community. If someone has like a sensory sensitivity where loud noises bother them, but someone else stims vocally very loudly, both of them are valid in their needs, but we need to try and figure out a way for both to coexist. And so I think that like the concept within this situation is also a concept of conflicting access needs. I know that there are like words that would upset me if they were said around me, even if they were tics, like not even necessarily like a slur, but like if I have something that is a trigger for me, it might be upsetting to hear that as a tic. And
Really?
so the conversation would have to be had about how the needs can intersect and how both parties can work to find a common solution. Both parties' needs are valid, and no one should have the trump card. There's a very excellent counselor that I follow on TikTok talks about the conversational game of the trump card, where you say that you cannot be held accountable because your trauma or your condition or your identity is the most important one. And so I think that what's important is in healthy relationships, healthy friendships, and healthy communities, no one holds the trump card. And I think getting that education is very important.
That's a good point. How old were you when the coprolalia started?
I was diagnosed with Tourette's when I was 13, and I had had tics starting when I was 7. But I didn't have my first coprolalia tic until I was, I think, a freshman or sophomore in college.
Wow. What was that like I mean, for so long also knowing how much we other people with coprolalia in our community, suddenly to have that urge, to get that premonitory urge to say those things, was that a shock to you? What was that experience like when it started?
It was really scary. I have always had complex vocal tics. I've ticked sentences for a very long time, and I've always had complex vocal tics. And so I guess I kind of knew in the back of my head that like coprolalia was a possibility. And I had also spent a very long time, and I had spent a lot of energy being like, not everybody with Tourette's swears, it's not representative. And then when I started having coprolalia, I was like, oh shit, both as a tic and as a reaction. No. Sorry, that was a bad joke. But it was like, oh shit, I've got to deal with this now. And I think it kind of changed the way I perceived Tourette's advocacy. Actually, this was a great conversation I had with someone I know yesterday about how in like the 80s and 90s, when the queer liberation movement began, there were a lot of people that were what is called a picket fencer, where we're like, oh, we're gay, but we're not like weird gay. We just want to have a white picket fence and 2.5 kids and a golden retriever. We just happen to both be men, or we just happen to both be women.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was it was a way of being like, these other gay people, they're different. We're not like those gay people. We're normal. And I feel like a lot of Tourette's advocacy focuses on the picket fencers, where it's like, yes, I have tics, but it doesn't impact my life. I can still do important and great things. I can still be a leader. I can still do all of this. And I'm not like those people who have Tourette's, who swear and have tic attacks and use mobility aids and X, Y, and Z. And it's not just within queer advocacy, and it's not just within Tourette's advocacy. In like, I feel like I should mention that I am also autistic. I feel like we've been talking about autism a lot, and it sounds like I'm like talking about it in a very theoretical way, but like I am also autistic. People who are autistic, we will focus on like, oh, we're able to do so much. We're logical. We're able to figure things out. We're able to look at things from a different perspective. And that makes us not just normal, but better than normal. And we try to distance ourselves from the people who have high support needs, or the people who have like variable support needs.
Mm-hmm.
For a while within disability advocacy, there's kind of like two conflicting things, where it's like either my disability is a superpower and I am going to be able to do great things because of my disability, and it makes me extra awesome, and you should hire me for capitalism. And then there's the other side where people are like, oh, these people with disabilities are so sad and they can't do anything and they can't care for themselves, and we need to be able to take care of them for them because they can't care for themselves. And it feels like in a lot of circles, those are the two extremes. And that's not the way that the world works. The world is not black and white. It exists in shades of gray. And so going back to like the self-advocacy question, part of the reason that I self-advocate is not even necessarily like just for myself. It's for the next person with Tourette's who comes along. I've experienced educational discrimination at a higher education level. And it was mind-boggling to me that this happened, because it's like, was I really the first person with Tourette's, and was I really the first person with coprolalia that you've ever encountered? It boggled my mind that I was the first person that they had encountered like that. And so by advocating for myself and fighting for my needs, and like even like going so far as to like get a lawyer involved, doing all of this has kind of, I think, made them think, okay, is this a hill we'll want to die on in future? Not even necessarily just that, but like seeing me not just survive my internship year, but thrive during my internship year, is that going to challenge their perceptions of what a counselor with Tourette's can look like? My self-advocacy has to do with representation for young people with Tourette's and young autistic people. Somehow, I don't know if this was on purpose or not, but like somehow I have ended up with a caseload of many clients with tic disorders. I think I used the term an empathetic shorthand before. It's very much like, oh, Mason gets it. Mason knows what's up because Mason has this same experience. You have to see it to believe it. Like, you have to be able to see people in the positions that you're looking for with similar lives to you in order to believe you can do it. Like, I volunteered for the Tim Howard Leadership Academy for like 6 years. During my first time I was there, it was the first time I had met someone else with Tourette's in person. I remember very specifically Dr. Cox, who is a professor and has a doctorate in social work and teaches, I believe, at Stockton University. I remember feeling so seen and so understood. I didn't even speak to this woman, like, to her face. And like, I remember feeling so seen and so validated because a lot of the other adults, including a lot of the other coaches at the NJCTS, were people with mild tics. So like people who have like facial twitches or whistling tics or very mild tics. And I had very obvious tics. And Dr. Cox didn't have like the same vocal tics that I did, but she had very obvious physical tics. And she was able to do her presentation and share her knowledge and share the things that she had experienced. And it was like, okay, so I can be a successful adult with Tourette's and I don't have to grow out of it. A lot of the adults that we see who are representations of people with Tourette's are people who have grown out of it.
Absolutely. Having visibility and representation across that spectrum is so important. Well, this has been a really amazing call, Mason. Thank you so much for taking that. I wish we could just go on another hour. Let me know next time you're in New York and we'll hang out. Are you going to do Tim Howard Academy this year? I just submitted my app like 2 days ago for it.
Probably not, because the thing is, I'm starting my full-time job post-graduation in June. I feel like I wouldn't want to like take like a bunch of days off like 2 months after starting a new job. And also, kind of like what we mentioned, I live in Minnesota.
Right.
So if I'm going to go to the Tim Howard Leadership Academy, that's like a plane ticket. And that's like spending time away from like my job when I could be making more money than I would make at the Tim Howard Leadership Academy. Shout out to the Tim Howard Leadership Academy, though, for actually paying their coaches a stipend. That's excellent.
We do. Yeah, it's a great program. Always opportunities to do more. But yeah, it's a really great program. And that we do pay our coaches a stipend. Definitely helps. But been awesome having you here on The Uptick.
Yeah.
Look forward to chatting with you again.
Thank you for listening to The Uptick, brought to you by the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, empowering you to stretch the boundaries to live your best life. The NJ Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, NJCTS, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented on this podcast. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any guest, nor do we advocate any treatment.